on, it's not letting me change the page. So we're going to go through the components necessary to understand, to be able to develop a budget, and also talk about some of the problems that you may encounter in different areas. So what is actually part of your budget varies by the sponsor, and they may call different categories by different names than what we call them internally. Locally, when you are trying to spend your funds, you'll be using object codes. And so our budgets are tied pretty much to the requirements that Research Financial Services has in helping you make sure that the funds are spent and tracked correctly internally. For the purposes of this presentation, and pretty much in general, we use the NSF budget categories. The budget templates that you receive from ORS were initially created based on NSF budget categories because that is where we did the bulk of our proposals. Now, that doesn't mean because you do submissions to NEH or foundations that these categories don't work. They're pretty much categories that all sponsors want information on when it comes to spending funds on. I will note, though, regardless of whatever the sponsor requires for the submission, OU requires a detailed budget. So if the sponsor says, we're going to give you $50,000 and we're not going to tell you how it has to be spent, doesn't mean that you don't have to develop a detailed budget. You still have to develop one because when it comes time to spend it, Research Financial Services is going to want to know how much funds you're projecting that you're going to spend for personnel versus supplies. So you have to have a detailed budget regardless of what the sponsor wants. These are the normal budget categories of spending that we look at when we develop a budget. And we're going to go through each of these a little bit and explain some more about them. But the facilities administrative cost we're not going to go into on this presentation. We cover that in the third one. So your personnel cost, you're looking usually at the faculty that are going to be involved, and some may be on academic appointments, some may be and have summertime, some may be on 12-month appointments. You may have professional staff, temporary staff, hourly people, graduate students, other professionals that might be involved. Some problem areas are clerical and administrative support. That is very limited and it's highly subject to audit. Research Financial Services will not allow any clerical administrative support unless you're doing something like a center or you have special justification why you have such a large amount of clerical administrative support. So if you have a small amount of clerical or administrative support that's needed, maybe you need someone to make travel arrangements for a large group involved in your proposal, you may want to hire someone part-time to do that as a project coordinator. It's not uncommon that sponsors will limit or will specify types of personnel that need to be involved or how much they can be paid, or that you can't have any payments at all. They may say there are no senior personnel costs allowed. You can have funds for a graduate student and that's it. In the OU budget forms and on many of the federal agencies, you'll have two sections that cover your personnel costs, sections A and sections B. And I will note that on our budgets, the only cost that we're concerned about in sections A and B, or for personnel cost at the top part of your budget, are OU personnel only. If you've got consultants or you've got people from subcontracts like HSC that are also working on the proposal, those are handled in other areas. So payments for anyone who is employed by us goes in these personnel cost area, and that includes supplemental pay. Supplemental pay is another problem area. It's very restricted and it requires special approvals. And for the most part, ORS will give you a heads up that those special approvals are needed. but we will let you include that supplemental pay in your budget. The problem that you will run into if you don't go ahead and look at what those special approvals involve, which is provost requirements, if it doesn't qualify, then you're going to have to pay that person on a different salary line that has higher fringe. So you may want to take that into consideration and project them with a higher amount of fringe and then try to work out the supplemental pay later. Then you'll have extra funds you can shift someplace else. If you've got payments for fellowships or stipends, they may not go under the personnel cost area of the budget. In fact, I can say like 99% of the time they won't, because they'll go under participant support or another area of the budget. Primarily, the types of funds that are listed under personnel cost are funds that are going to have fringe benefits tied to them. I also wanted to mention that it's very common that guidelines will have eligibility restrictions for personnel. For example, they may say you have to have been in the career field a certain number of years. They may have requirements that you've got to have a person involved in the proposal that's from a minority. There could be a restriction on how many PIs you can have from the same institution. So you need to be sure and look at what type of eligibility restrictions there might be in your solicitation as you're putting your team together. Some other things that you want to consider when you're looking at developing the team that's going to be doing the work for your proposal is, why are they on the project? If you've got someone that's on the project and you just have them involved because you want their name, then, and that's all they're providing you, then that's probably somebody you want to list as an advisor or a mentor, and not someone that you want to show is working a heavy amount of time on the project if they're not really doing it. Are there requirements in the guidelines to have advisory boards or evaluations? I mentioned before special criteria that they look at as your team is composed, and this can have a big impact on if you have subcontracts or other organizations that are going to be helping you do this project. That may be a way for you to involve more diverse, not only by ethnic considerations, but also by different careers or professions. So for example, maybe you could have a STEM component with this proposal, so you get an organization that has a high reputation for their STEM work to come in and do that component in this project. You want to make sure that you're using the correct numbers, which ORS is going to help you ensure that your salary and your fringe and your tuition is taken into account for your OU people. But if you've got subcontracts or consultants, you want to make sure that the contact person you're working with is running those numbers through their organization's loops to make sure that they're giving you a number that includes the correct fringe and indirect cost. You need to consider when hiring may occur for the people that are going to be working on the proposal. So for example, if your start date is in March, are you really going to hire a GRA in March to work on that proposal? Or are you going to wait until the summer to hire them or the fall to hire them? Because that's going to affect how many months maybe they're going to be working on that proposal. Who is a key member of the team? So not everybody on your team may be a key member. You may need to look at the sponsor's definition of what key people are, or what, for example, what's a co-investigator versus a collaborator. And that definition can change between sponsors. So don't assume just because NIH says a collaborator is unfunded that NSF considers a collaborator as being an unfunded person, because they don't. You want to keep in mind too the level of participation the people on your team have. And you also have to consider what you want in the submission. So for example, maybe you have an advisor who's not heavily involved in the proposal. So normally you wouldn't consider them a key member, but they have a certain cachet that comes with their name, and you want to show their bio sketch with the proposal. And you can't do that unless you identify them as a key team member. So that is part of the strategy of what you have to consider as you're composing your team. So in personnel costs, you also have fringe benefits. And these are composed of many different things like dental insurance and life insurance. And they vary by the different appointments that personnel have on the proposal. So for example, your senior personnel who works full-time is going to have a higher fringe rate than your grad student is going to have. Our fringe benefits rates are negotiated, and in fact, just about everyone who has a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, their benefit rates are also part of that negotiation. And over the life of the proposal, the fringe benefits will usually change. So I just wanted to mention that so you wouldn't be surprised. Fringe benefits have to be charged at the rate that they're being paid. So if you got an award and it's 3 years long, and in year 2 you decide that you're going to have request a supplement, the supplement's going to be done at whatever the current fringe rates are for that year. Indirect cost charges usually don't change during the life of the award. So how do you determine what a cost is? We get a lot of questions about this. Some information your PDS can give you if you give us the name of the co-PI that's involved. We normally don't provide, even if you give us a name, the salaries for grad students and things like that. You need to go back to your colleagues or your department chair or director or a person who handles finance items within your college and ask what's normally paid within your college. We do have the minimums that are established by the grad college, and we can give you those and we can set your budget up for that. But that puts you in a bad position if you go back later and you're trying to hire a grad student and you find out that your college actually pays $5,000 or $6,000 more than what the grad college minimum is, then it's going to make it harder for you to hire a student to work on your proposal. As far as like salaries for postdocs and things like that, it's pretty much the same as the grad students issue. Talk with your experienced colleagues and members in your department to find out what the normal ranges are for those types of positions. The provost does have a listing for certain positions like research scientist and things like that you can go to. The links are on the ORS website, or your PDS can help provide it. That gives you some basic starting amount, but you're better off doing some research to find out what's normally charged for those people. So now we're going to shift out of personnel and we're going to go to equipment. So equipments are items that cost over $5,000 per unit and have a useful life of 1 year or more. You want to make sure when you're looking at this item that you're looking at one item. So for example, a computer usually won't qualify because a computer comes in more than one part, because you have like the hard drive and the monitors and things like that, unless it's a really special computer that's got a special hard drive and things like that on it. Sometimes equipment cost can include freight and shipping costs, training and installation, construction and remodeling. A lot of times that is limited by the sponsor. The sponsor may say equipment can cost this much inclusive of XYZ, but not inclusive of this. An example of a good thing that some include and some don't would be any type of warranty or service agreement that might come with equipment. Fabricated equipment is equipment where you are going to order parts of something and put them together to make an item that's going to be valued at $5,000 or more that you're going to add to your inventory. So let's say you're going to spend a couple $1,000s for a DBM and a couple $1,000s for some test stuff, and you're going to put all this together and you're going to make some kind of a special test assembly out of it. And once you get all those parts together, they cost $6,000. Then you've got a piece of fabricated equipment, and all of those costs, even for the little bits and pieces, can go under fabricated equipment. You've got to be sure and mention that in your budget justification and make sure that you note that when you're doing your expenditures. The reason why is equipment is exempt from facilities and administrative costs. So that has a big impact on your budget. If you're constructing something, you don't have to put those under materials and supplies and incur IDC. You can put them under fabricated equipment. I will note that if you do much business with the state, that their definition of equipment is different. Their threshold, I can't believe now, I can't remember if it's 300 or 500, but it's very much lower. If the definition of the sponsor that you're doing business with has a lower threshold than the federal limit, which is the limit OU follows, we will follow the sponsor's limit. So you just have to let us know, if we don't catch it, that there's a different limitation on equipment, and we'll make sure that it's noted in the budget so post-award knows that. At the end of your project, the disposition of the equipment has to be worked out, especially if it wasn't already established in the award documents. So what this means is you may purchase a piece of equipment from NSF, for example, and the ownership of that equipment may end up being with OU, or the ownership may still belong to NSF. So we have to go back to the sponsor if the ownership isn't clear and ask, when your proposal is done, who gets to keep the equipment. They may let you keep it for future work that you're doing in other related types of research, or they may decide that we want this item shipped to XYZ location because we've just given funding to this person and that will help save them from making an equipment purchase. Any sponsor may require quotes at submission or at some point in review or at award for equipment items that you're purchasing. So it's wise not to just make a guess off the top of your head that an oscilloscope costs $50,000, because it's going to look funny when you, few weeks after submission, the program officer comes back and says, oh, by the way, can you send me the quote for that item? And then you have to go back to them with a quote for $20,000. It doesn't look good that you were asking for $30,000 more. So be aware of the fact that for equipment, usually quotes are wanted. Now it is also, if the quote that you have doesn't have something on it that says the quote's good for a certain amount of time, you can include additional funds in that quote in anticipation of inflation prior to when the expected purchase date may be. So that is something that you might want to consider when you're providing equipment quotes or equipment estimates too.
Fran,
Yes.
we have a quick question.
Okay.
So where do the, in case you haven't already covered this, where do the equipment costs that are less than $5,000 per item go in the budget?
So if it's an equipment item that costs less than $5,000 that you're not going to be combining together into a fabricated item, then those go under materials and supplies. Okay, so travel. So some things to be aware of in spending in the travel area. For any airfare that you're doing for any federal agencies, you're going to come across something called the Fly America Act, and that means that you have to use domestic air carriers. If you're flying foreign, you may find you still have to do Fly America between here and the other countries, unless that country has a reciprocal agreement with the United States that when their people are working on sponsored activities, they will allow them to use American carriers if the American carriers have a cheaper price. There is usually some wiggle room if you're flying between different countries overseas that you can use local transport for that. But you want to make sure that you have that cleared with your sponsor, because you don't want to find out after the fact that they're not going to cover it because there was a Delta flight that you could have taken between those two countries. As part of your travel cost, that includes any of your lodging, hotels, apartment rentals, things like that. Per diem, which depending on how the sponsor uses the term, may be just food or maybe food and hotel. Usually federal agencies want you to use the government rates. So there's a page you can go to for the government rates. You pick what state or country you're flying to, and it'll give you information based on what the government expects those costs to be. And that's what the government expects you to use. Those using that information, the government rates, is usually accepted by anyone that we're doing sponsored projects with. And if you're not going to use those rates, you should explain in the justification why you're not. This could be beneficial to you. It could show that you're thinking and you're trying to save money. So for example, you're going to travel to Washington, D.C., and that's where your parents live, and you know you're going to stay with your parents. Then instead of projecting using the government rates, which are going to be so much higher, project what the real costs are going to be and explain that you'll be staying with relatives and are therefore saving the cost to the sponsor in this area of the budget. Car rentals you can run into issues with because some sponsors allow them and some don't. So you want to possibly double check with either prior people who have done work with that sponsor to see if they covered them or not, or to see if there's any information in this specific solicitation that covers that. Local transportation, how you're going to get around, is usually covered in travel. If you do use mileage, like if you're taking your own car or for transportation between the home and the airport, the policy at OU is that you'll use either the federal rate or the state rate, depending on the sponsor. If the funding is coming from a federal agency, you're expected to use the federal mileage rate, which is established by the IRS. If you're using travel with the state agencies, they're going to expect you to use the state rate, which normally follows the IRS rate, but not always. Sometimes it's a cent or two cheaper. Usually, if you don't want to look up the state rate, you're usually okay citing that you're using the federal rate, and usually the state agencies will accept that. Registration fees depend on how they're worded in the solicitation, if they're considered part of travel or not. Most of the time, if your travel involves registration for something like a conference attendance, most of the sponsors will pay for. You may also have additional safety and security costs that can be included as part of your travel expenses. For example, if you need a guard or you have to hire like escorted travel, there's actually notes usually in the government per diem charts that covers that is an allowed cost. Some agencies consider travel to Canada and or Mexico as domestic travel instead of foreign travel. So you want to see if your agency that you're doing business with has that type of definition for travel to Canada and Mexico. There are a lot of international travel requirements and restrictions, especially now that we're in the pandemic climate. But even before that, there's also just in general, anytime you're traveling internationally, you can expect that there's going to be more scrutiny of those charges and the reason why you're traveling. Any travel that you do in your budget, even though your budget may be approved and awarded, may still have to be approved before you travel by the sponsor. So make sure you check with post-award that gets cleared before you make your travel arrangements. And we're finding that this is a really hot interest for audits, especially if it involves foreign travel. So be very careful with making sure that you've got the permissions that you need to do the travel that you're doing before you incur those costs. Participant support costs. So whether or not you can have participant support in your budget depends on if the agency allows it or not. And Participant support is for training or workshop type events. This isn't for if you've got participants in a focus group or you're doing some type of a clinical trial. Those are called incentives or participant incentives. So this is for when you're hosting or creating an event, not for you attending. The people that you are basing these costs on cannot be an employee of OU and cannot be an employee of the grant. So for example, if you hire a GRA to work on a proposal, then that GRA cannot be included in participant support cost calculations because they're an employee of the grant and essentially of the university at that point. That doesn't mean that you have to bar them from walking through the door. It just means that they can't be used in calculating expenses. Common cost in participant support are things like stipends to pay someone for attending, which seems strange. If you're paying a teacher to like come to a workshop that you're doing, you can also pay for their substitutes to cover the classes while they're gone. Those also fall under stipends. Cost of transportation to arrange for the people attending the workshop to arrive at the site. That also includes their hotel or where you're going to house them. Their funds for them for their per diem. If you've got subsistence that's being offered as part of the conference, for example, you're going to have a working lunch. And I emphasize working because any food that you provide as part of your workshop costs have to be something that's going to be a working type of item that you're going to be doing. So for example, if you were going to say, oh, we're going to take everybody out for dinner after the workshop, and that's all you say, the chances of a sponsor approving that are pretty much never. It's very seldom that they'll approve any type of dinner arrangement. But if you're going to ask for it, you need to also justify it from the standpoint of this will be a working dinner. We'll have a speaker followed by discussion, something to justify why that cost should be included as part of your training cost related to this workshop. A lot of times participant support funds will come with extra requirements on them. For example, if you're doing a proposal with NSF and you put funds into participant support, they will not let you move those funds out without special permission. You can move additional funds in, but you can't move them out. The reason why is NIH has a big focus on training the future scientists of the world. And so they treat participant support cost as being very important in a proposal. And they don't want them looked at as an extra pool of funds that are easily rated for you to cover costs of unexpected expenditures in other areas of the budget. They had problems with that years ago, and so that's how come they made that a protected area. Some other direct costs, we mentioned materials and supplies. Those include things like expendable equipment, chemicals, computer software, any computer or laptop that costs less than $5,000 per item. Lab supplies, if you're able to measure them. For example, if you're going to buy a cylinder of gas that's going to be used solely for this proposal, then yes, you can include that as a lab supply. If you're not going to buy like a cylinder for your specific project, then you've got to have a way to measure the units that you're using versus what's being used in general for the work in your lab. This ties back to it being allocable to the proposal that you're working on. Other things are like research materials, small instruments, just anything that's consumable. I will note that if you have animal research involved, that the animals that are purchased themselves, like the mice, are considered a research material and supply, but their care, like their housing and their food and things like that, are considered an other direct other cost. And I would also caution you, don't use the term office supplies because that is a red flag for auditors. An office supply is something that you have in the office for general use. If you've got something that might normally be considered an office supply, for example, you're going to have to order some pens to hand out for people doing surveys for this project. Well, normally pens would be a standard office supply, but you're not going to be using them in the office. You're going to be using them for the project. Then you want to call those project supplies. Some other direct costs are going to be publication costs. Those can include page charges. If you have to pay something to get published or disseminate your information, maybe you're going to make up some handouts or some cards that are going to be handed out at a conference. That would count as a dissemination expense. If you have a poster that's going to be presented at a conference, either as part of a display that you're doing, or maybe you have a graduate student who's going to be doing a poster on your project that's going to be displayed or competitively entered. That's all part of disseminating the results of your research, and so that can count under publication costs. If you have computer service charges, for example, maybe your department has a policy of charging for internet fees for research that you're doing, or if you're going to be standing up a separate web page related to your research that's going to have some extra charges, this may be where you would put those. If you have shipping and handling charges associated with your materials and supplies, Research Financial Services has asked those to be split off as a separate line item. Whether or not it also includes equipment may depend on what's allowed by the sponsor in your equipment charges. If the sponsor allows your equipment to include shipping and handling, I would most certainly not list them separately under the shipping line, because the shipping line under other direct costs will incur indirect charges. If they're entered under equipment, if they're allowed, then they don't have indirect costs charged on them. And this change has come about because of new software that's going into place for research services. They have to track those separately now. I mentioned before, participants in focus groups and surveys and things like that aren't participant support costs. Those payments go under incentives. We find that incentives are usually done in the form of gift cards. Secure handling is required of any type of incentive that you've got. So you've got to have some type of tracking mechanism. And if you're using gift cards, you need to make sure you're going to comply with the provost policies on those, which Research Financial Services has a link to those policies on their website. Tuition remission at the University of Oklahoma is required on all sponsored projects that have GRA involved, unless the sponsor specifically restricts the inclusion of tuition in their guidelines. Some sponsors allow extra tuition funds. However, in the last several months, there's been a change in the uniform guidance, and federal agencies are no longer going to allow that. So if you're doing business with a foundation, a nonprofit, or a commercial entity, and you want to include additional tuition funds, you can. We just need to work that out on your budget. But if you're doing business with a federal agency, you can only collect the tuition based on the formula that the grad college has us using. The collection of tuition remission varies by the institution that you're at. At OU, we have a set monthly charge that's based on how many months the GRA is on the proposal. And we know, in fact, it's an accepted common practice around the world pretty much, that a normal appointment for a GRA is 50%. So if you have a GRA on for 12 months, you don't calculate their tuition at 6 months because they're a 50% appointment. They're on the proposal for 12 months, they're calculated at 12 months. I would recommend, if you have very many students involved in your proposals, that you go to the OU tuition remission policy on the VPRP website and read the policy and the associated FAQs, because we get a lot of questions in this area. And there are just a lot of limitations that are put on by the grad college. One of the benefits of tuition remission is that it's not included in F&A calculations. So you don't get indirect charged on the tuition cost. Other direct cost subcontracts. We need an entire subcontract proposal for any subcontract that you have, regardless of what is needed in the submission. So that includes the statement of work, a budget justification, an institutional letter of commitment. Sometimes it can include special forms that the sponsor requires, and a copy of their rate agreement or the link to where their rate agreement is. If they don't have a rate agreement, they can use the federal de minimis. And as mentioned before, all of the IDC information is going to be covered in part 3. If you have a consultant, this is a person who's providing minor support for your proposal. The sponsor may require a letter or an email of their commitment that has to be included with the submission. Internally, for the most part, ORS doesn't require you to show us a letter or an email from the consultant, but we will advise you to obtain one where the consultant agrees to what they're doing for your project and the amount, if any, of funds that they expect to receive. There have been some issues at award where consultants didn't remember what they had verbally agreed to, and instead of doing XYZ work for $5,000, now wanted $10,000. And so the PI had to go back and redo their budget to cover that. For consultant services, the fee is usually determined by the number of days or hours of the consultant time, and it has to be commensurate with the expectation of the career field. So if normally a person in your field would get $250 an hour for consulting, then that's what the people reviewing your proposal would expect to see. They would be surprised to see you charging $5,000 an hour for that work. You can also include travel for your consultant to participate in events with you as part of their consultant fee, but you want to make sure that that is clear in your justification, that so much of the funds is for X amount of hours at X cost, and so much is for travel. Very common for consultants is for their travel to actually be included in the primary budget, so they would fall into your travel area. If it's a contractual or vendor expense, those are usually for things like services or fees where they would do the similar or same service for someone else. A lot of times we call this an off-the-shelf type of purchase, where you would just be going and buying something from someone. So an example of this might be, maybe you're going to get a website constructed, and so you're going to go to an agency, and that's what they do as a business. They just consult websites, and they're not going to spend a lot of time with you other than getting some general idea of what you want on this spreadsheet. Then they're probably going to be a vendor. So that the nature of the relationship that you have between different organizations, whether they're a subcontract, a consultant, or a vendor, may change depending on the work that they're doing on different proposals. A lot of it ties back to how involved they are with programmatic decisions and authorship of publications and reports. So if you've got someone who's heavily involved in making decisions and authorship, they're probably going to be a subcontract. And we have a decision matrix that we can send you to help you determine this relationship. Communication costs are usually an other direct cost other charge. This usually are things like FedEx charges, fax charges, postage, and a red flag area on postage is that you can't have stamps. They had such a big problem with people stealing stamps and losing track of them that the government came out and said, we are not paying for stamps anymore. You have to do postage, like metered postage charges. If you're including phone calls on your proposal, you have to make sure you know how you're going to directly attribute those to that project. So you have a phone that is only used for that project's calls, or you have some type of a log sheet where you note that call and the length of it so that you can pull it out of your phone charges. So you know that you're not charging all of your long distance phone calls to this project when part of them should have been like general office calls or charged to other proposals. Some other examples of cost are copying, the incentives, advising, advertising, like if you need to get participants in a study or to recruit students, maintenance agreements, audiovisual services, construction and renovation costs. And by the way, if you're doing constructions or renovation costs, you may need to provide a letter or an email to ORS regarding those, because we want to make sure that your department chair, your dean is aware that if you receive this award, they may have to help pay some of the expenses to having renovations done to support this proposal. If you're doing a workshop or conference that isn't allowed under participant support, because not all sponsors allow it, they fall under other direct other. If you're doing other types of technical administrative meetings or planning meetings for proposal, then that goes under other direct other. Including food cost in those meetings or workshops that come under other direct other is usually scrutinized, and you want to make sure that you state in the justification that there are food costs involved, because you want to be upfront about it, and know that even though the sponsor approves them, when it comes time to spending it, you may want to recheck with the sponsor and ensure that they're still on board with it, because we have had a couple of cases where it was stated in the budget justification that food costs were incurred, and then when the spending took place, the sponsor came back and said, no, we never allow food costs. Sorry, we made a mistake and didn't catch that. You had it in your budget justification. And as always with participant support, it goes the same for this. Any food costs that you're doing have to be a part of something working that is going to be going on. Your costs for doing your meetings or workshops can include fees for hosting those services, or application costs, like if you have to maintain a Zoom account special just for being able to do these workshops, then you can include those costs. You still have to look at, is this the only thing you're going to do with that Zoom account or not? Because if the cost for the Zoom account is something that is going to be shared amongst different activities that you're doing, you've got to have a way to break those costs out and attribute what portion is going to go to this proposal. Space rentals, service fees, project evaluation costs are usually also under other direct other. I will note on the project evaluation, there are a couple of sponsors that include those outside of the regular part of the budget. So they're included with your total costs, but they don't have any indirect cost calculated on them. You can have requirements that the evaluation be done by an internal organization or external organization. And it's more common if the sponsor specifies external, that they want external. So if you have an internal agency that you think is the most qualified to do that evaluation, you want to go back to your program officer and clear that with them, that because they may want someone external to preclude the appearance that there is a conflict of interest in having an internal organization do that evaluation. Do we have any questions? Cindy is saying there's no.
I don't have any questions in the chat. So we're going to go ahead and pause this recording just for a moment so you can swap